Watch what happens in the next 10 seconds. A dog is lying quietly across the room. Its owner picks up a stuffed toy, not even a real animal, and starts petting it, talking to it the way you'd talk to a baby. The dog gets up, walks straight over, shoves itself between the owner and the toy. Some dogs go further, they snap at it. For years, calling this jealousy got you laughed out of a psychology department. Jealousy was supposed to require something dogs don't have the ability to understand what's going on inside someone else's head. So either your dog was faking an emotion it doesn't have, or something else was going on. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what two separate research teams found when they tested this for real with a stuffed dog, a jack-o'-lantern, and a children's book. What they discovered wasn't, your dog loves you exactly like a human partner would. It was something older, stranger, and in some ways more interesting. A reflex your dog shares with a human infant, not a human adult. This is Pet Mind Labs. Let's stop guessing and start seeing. Here's the trap most pet content falls into. Someone posts a video of their dog shoving its way between them and a new partner, or growling at a stuffed animal, and the caption says, "My dog is so jealous. He loves me so much." It's cute. It's also almost certainly the wrong emotion, described the wrong way. When a person feels jealous, really jealous, the kind that ruins a relationship, it's not a simple reflex. It requires you to model another mind. You have to imagine what your partner might be feeling for someone else, guess at their intentions, compare yourself to a rival, and story build a threat that hasn't even happened yet. Psychologists call the ability to do that theory of mind, reasoning about what's going on inside somebody else's head. It's a sophisticated piece of cognitive machinery, and for a long time, scientists assumed you needed it to feel jealousy at all, which is exactly why, for decades, most researchers treated animal jealousy as something owners were imagining a story we project onto behavior because it flatters us. Dogs don't do complex social math. So the textbook answer was, your dog isn't jealous, it's just reacting to a change in its environment. Full stop. Except that answer has a hole in it big enough to drive an experiment through. Because human jealousy didn't appear out of nowhere either. Developmental psychologists have long pointed out that babies, long before they have any theory of mind, long before they can imagine what's happening in someone else's head, already protest when a parent's attention goes to another child. A 6-month-old can't reason about anyone's intentions, but put that same 6-month-old in their mother's lap, have her cuddle a lifelike baby doll instead, and the infant will reach for her, fuss, try to wedge back into her attention. Something is clearly happening. It's just not the sophisticated, self-aware kind of jealousy an adult feels. So here's the real question, the one this video is actually about. Is there a simpler, older version of jealousy, one that doesn't need to imagine another mind, just needs to notice a bond being threatened? And if that version exists in human infants, is it possible dogs, who've spent something like 15,000 years wound into human social life, have it too? That's not a cute internet question anymore. That's a testable one. And in 2014, someone finally tested it. It's worth knowing this question has a long, awkward history. Charles Darwin himself wrote about jealousy in dogs back in the 1870s, describing a dog that seemed to sulk when its owner petted another dog. But for well over a century after that, mainstream comparative psychology treated stories like Darwin's as exactly that, stories, anecdotes. The field had a name for the mistake it was trying to avoid: anthropomorphism, projecting human inner life onto an animal because the behavior looks familiar to us. And the caution was reasonable. Plenty of animal behavior that looks emotional turns out to have a much simpler explanation once you test it properly. The problem is that, let's not overinterpret slowly hardened into, let's not test it at all. For decades, almost nobody ran a real experiment. They just argued about it in journals. In 2014, psychologists Christine Harris and Carolyn Provost, working at UC San Diego, ran what was at the time the first real experimental test of jealous behavior in dogs. Not a survey. Not, my dog does this, trust me. An actual controlled experiment, published in the journal PLOS One. They brought in 36 dogs, one at a time, with their owners, into a quiet room. Small dogs under 35 pounds, because the design needed the dog to physically fit into what happened next. Each dog and owner went through 3 short, 1-minute scenes, always in the same room, always with a hidden video camera capturing every move. Condition 1. The owner picked up a realistic stuffed dog, one that could bark, whine, and wag its tail with the press of a hidden button, and interacted with it exactly like it was a real animal, talked to it, petted it, cuddled it, and completely ignored their actual dog sitting right there. Condition 2. The owner did the exact same thing, with the exact same warmth, except now the object was a jack-o'-lantern pail, something with a face, but nothing that moves or makes a sound like an animal. Condition 3. The owner sat and read a children's pop-up book out loud, which played a short melody, timed to roughly match how long the stuffed dog barked for. Same owner, same room, same amount of affection and attention withdrawn from the dog. The only thing that changed across the 3 scenes was what the owner was giving that attention to. Here's what the researchers found, and these are the actual numbers from the paper, not a paraphrase. When the owner cuddled the stuffed dog, the real dog pushed or touched the owner significantly more often than in the other 2 conditions. It pushed or touched the toy itself, significantly more too. It tried to physically wedge its body between the owner and the toy, significantly more often. And close to a quarter of the dogs snapped at the stuffed toy during the interaction behavior that essentially never showed up toward the jack-o'-lantern or the book. None of that happened, at anywhere near the same rate, with the jack-o'-lantern or the book. The dogs weren't just annoyed that their owner's attention had drifted somewhere. They responded differently, depending on what it had drifted to. And there's a detail in this study that quietly does a lot of work. After the stuffed dog scene ended, most of the real dogs went and sniffed the toy's rear end, the way dogs greet each other. Which tells you something important. To the dog, this wasn't obviously a toy. For a moment, it read as a potential rival, a social one. Now here's where I want to slow down, because this is the part most retellings of this study get slightly wrong, and it's the whole point of the video. Harris and Provost did not conclude dogs feel jealousy exactly like humans do. They were careful, deliberate scientists, and the term they landed on was primordial jealousy. Primordial means early, foundational, the root form something grew from. Their argument, in their own words, is that this points to a primordial form of jealousy, an emotional state that doesn't require the complex mental gymnastics human jealousy needs, not modeling a rival's intentions, not imagining betrayal, just a built-in functional alarm. Something is between me and my most important relationship, right now, and I need to act on that. Think of it like the relationship between a reflex and a decision. If a doctor taps your knee and your leg kicks, that's not you choosing to kick. It's a reflex, older and simpler than deliberate movement, but built from some of the same wiring. Harris and Provost's argument is that dog jealousy might be something like that, a functional, protective reflex that shares deep roots with human jealousy without needing the sophisticated cognitive story human jealousy usually comes wrapped in. Before the honest asterisk, one more small but important detail. The 2014 study only tested small dogs under 35 pounds because of how the experiment was physically staged. That means, strictly speaking, the original findings describe small dog behavior, not all dogs automatically. The 2018 replication used a broader mix of breeds and sizes and still found the core pattern, which is reassuring, but it's the kind of detail a careful channel names out loud instead of quietly smoothing over. Good science reports its own edges. Here's where a lesser channel stops the story with one cool study and a tidy conclusion. But a single experiment, no matter how well designed, leaves real questions open. And this one left a big one. The dog reacted more to the stuffed dog than to the jack-o'-lantern or book, but was that really about the social nature of the rival? Or was it simply that the stuffed dog moved, made noise, and seemed alive, and dogs get generally more aroused by anything that looks animate? Harris and Provost's design couldn't fully separate those 2 explanations. And there was a second nagging issue. Every dog in that first study was tested at home, in its own territory, so some of the pushing and snapping might have been about guarding space, not guarding a relationship. Good science doesn't leave a gap like that sitting around. 4 years later, a completely different lab tried to close it. In 2018, a research team at Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest, a completely independent lab, an ocean away from San Diego, published a follow-up in the journal Scientific Reports. And they built their experiment specifically to plug the holes in the first one. Instead of testing dogs at home, they tested 24 dogs in a neutral lab space. The dog didn't own removing territorial guarding from the equation entirely, and instead of a stuffed toy, they used something much harder to write off: real, live dogs. Each test dog watched its owner interact warmly with either a familiar dog, an unfamiliar dog, a familiar inanimate object, or an unfamiliar inanimate object like a remote control toy or a thermos. One honest detail about this sample: these weren't 24 random dogs. Owners had already filled out a questionnaire beforehand, and the researchers specifically recruited dogs whose owners said they already showed jealous behavior toward other dogs. So this study wasn't asking, does the average dog do this? It was asking, in dogs primed to react, does the pattern hold up to a sharper test? That's a real limitation worth naming, not a reason to throw the finding out. This design let them ask the sharper question the first study couldn't. Is it about anything unfamiliar or exciting showing up, or is it specifically about a social rival threatening the bond? The answer came back clean. The dogs showed plenty of curiosity and excitement toward the novel object too. They were just as interested in the strange remote control car as they were in the unfamiliar dog. But the behavior that mattered, turning back toward the owner, trying to interrupt and wedge into the interaction, monitoring the relationship that spiked specifically and significantly when the rival was another dog, not when it was an object, familiar or not. In the researchers' own words, the loss of the owner's attention wasn't, by itself, enough to trigger the behavior. What mattered was whether the relationship itself was being threatened by another social being. That's a more precise, more demanding finding than the first study could offer. It's not my dog hates change. It's my dog is specifically tracking whether something else is competing for a bond that matters to it. Put those two studies together and you get something genuinely useful in behavioral science, even though they don't agree on every detail. The Budapest team was actually skeptical of one piece of the first study. They questioned whether the stuffed dog was similar enough to a real animal for the dogs to treat it as a true social rival, rather than just a confusing, distressing object. So this isn't a clean, study 2 confirmed study 1 story. It's closer to two independent teams, pressure testing the same idea from different angles, disagreeing on some mechanics, and still landing on the same core pattern. Something protective happens, and it's calibrated to social threats, specifically, not general excitement. That kind of partial, honest agreement is more convincing than a tidy replication would be. There's a detail from the Budapest study worth sitting with a little longer, because it's the kind of thing that separates careful science from a headline. The researchers didn't just measure whether the dog reacted, they measured what kind of reaction it was. When the test partner was an unfamiliar object, like a toy car, the dog's curiosity was aimed at the object itself, sniffing it, watching it move, investigating. But when the test partner was a dog familiar, or not, a big share of that behavior redirected toward the owner, repeatedly checking the owner's face, trying to physically interrupt the interaction, orienting its whole body toward the relationship instead of the rival. That's a meaningfully different behavior pattern, not just a louder version of the same one. Curiosity points outward, at the interesting thing. This points inward, at the bond. The researchers even ruled out some obvious alternative explanations before landing on that conclusion, checking whether it could be explained by which dog was more dominant, more playful, more easily bored, or simply more territorial. None of those explained the pattern. What was left, after eliminating the alternatives one by one, was a response that tracked one specific thing. Is my relationship with this person being contested by another social being? And one more finding from that 2018 study deserves its own moment, because it changes how you should picture the whole thing. Unlike the 2014 study, where about a quarter of dogs snapped at the stuffed toy, the Budapest researchers reported essentially no aggressive behavior toward the real rival dogs. The test dogs pushed in, monitored, tried to interrupt, but they didn't escalate to snapping or growling at an actual dog the way some had at the fake one. One likely explanation the researchers raise: a lifelike stuffed animal that barks and wags, but doesn't behave like a real dog socially, may be confusing and destabilizing in a way a live dog, with its normal, readable body language, simply isn't. It's a reminder that jealousy in dogs isn't one fixed behavior. It's a flexible response that reads the actual situation, not just a switch that's either on or off. So where does that leave us? Knotted dogs are basically small, furry humans with the exact same feelings. And knotted dogs are simple machines reacting to stimuli. Somewhere more interesting and more honest than either extreme. Go back to that infant, the one reaching for her mother when the mother cuddles a lifelike doll instead. Nobody argues that baby is running a sophisticated internal story about her mother's romantic priorities. She doesn't need to. She just needs one thing: a built-in system that says, my most important bond is being redirected somewhere else, and that matters to my survival. That system doesn't require imagining anyone's inner life. It just requires noticing a threat to attachment and acting to close the gap. It also helps to know dogs aren't being singled out here. Harris and Provost themselves framed their study as part of a broader question in comparative psychology: whether primordial versions of complex human emotions might exist across social species that depend on specific individual bonds to survive, not just humans, and not only in the fully developed, self-aware form. The logic is simple. If a bond is important enough that losing it would matter for survival or well-being, evolution has reason to build some kind of alarm for threats to it long before it builds the sophisticated storytelling brain needed to worry about it consciously. Dogs, an animal that has spent thousands of generations wiring its entire survival strategy around a bond with a specific human, are about as strong a candidate for that kind of alarm as you could design on purpose. That's the frame both studies actually support. Not human-style romantic jealousy, with its imagined scenarios and wounded pride, but something structurally similar to what a human infant does protecting a bond it depends on, without needing to understand why the bond feels threatened. Your dog isn't running a story in its head about betrayal. It's running something more like a smoke alarm for its most important relationship. No narrative required, just a very old, very effective, act now signal. This actually lines up with something researchers already knew about dogs from a completely different angle: attachment. Back in 1998, a study out of Aotvas-Lorand University, the same university that would later run the 2018 jealousy replication, adapted a classic test from child psychology called the strange situation, originally designed to measure how securely infants are attached to a caregiver. They ran it with dogs instead of babies. The pattern matched almost point for point. With their owner in the room, dogs explored more, stayed calmer, acted braver. Take the owner out, and the dog's confidence dropped, the way a toddler's would. Owners function, behaviorally, as a secure base, a safe anchor the dog's whole sense of stability is built around. Line that up next to the jealousy findings, and the picture snaps into focus. You don't get a protect this bond alarm system for a relationship that doesn't matter. You get one for a secure base, the one relationship an animal's entire sense of safety is scaffolded on. The jealousy response isn't a strange, separate glitch in an otherwise simple animal. It's what you'd expect to find sitting right next to a real, measured attachment bond, guarding it. So let's reframe what you're actually looking at the next time your dog wedges itself between you and something or someone else. It is tempting, and honestly kind of flattering, to read that moment as, "My dog loves me so much it can't stand sharing me." Full human meaning included: possessiveness, insecurity, a story about being replaced. And there's a reason that reading feels so natural. It's the same reading we instinctively give another person who does that. But your dog almost certainly isn't running that story. It doesn't need to imagine your inner life or guess at your intentions to feel the pull to act. It just needs the much older, much simpler machinery. This bond matters. Something is between me and it. Close the distance. Here's why that distinction actually matters. Beyond being scientifically accurate, if you treat your dog's pushiness as calculated, human-style jealousy, a decision your dog is making about you, almost an accusation, it's easy to slide into thinking of it as something to correct, or worse, something to feel guilty about, like you did something wrong by petting a puppy. But if you understand it as a primordial attachment reflex, the same category of thing an infant does, the whole picture softens. It's not a judgment of you. It's not manipulation. It's an old piece of social wiring, doing exactly the job it evolved to do, keeping your dog oriented toward the relationship it depends on most. And there's a flip side worth sitting with too, because this isn't really a story about suspicion. It's a story about how seriously your dog takes its bond with you. An animal only develops a protect this relationship alarm for relationships worth protecting. Wolves raised alongside people don't show this pattern to nearly the same degree. It's something that seems to have sharpened specifically in the animal that built its whole survival strategy around living inside human relationships. The same wiring that makes your dog shove a stuffed toy out of the way is downstream of the same deep, real attachment that makes it wait by the door, sleep against your side, watch your face for information. It's not a separate, uglier trait bolted onto the sweet ones. It's the same bond, showing its teeth for a second when it feels crowded. That reframe also explains something a lot of owners notice but don't have language for. Why the same dog can be pushy with a stuffed toy in a lab and completely calm watching you hold a real baby at home. Context, history, and how threatened the specific bond actually feels all shape how loud that alarm goes off. It's not a fixed personality trait, my dog is the jealous type. It's a response that flexes with the situation, the same way a smoke alarm goes off differently depending on how much smoke is actually in the room. It also connects to something this channel has covered before. The bond between you and your dog isn't just a feeling, it runs on real, measurable biology. Mutual gaze between dogs and owners has been shown to raise oxytocin, the same hormone that ties a parent to an infant, in both species at once. An attachment system with that much shared hormonal wiring isn't the kind of thing you'd expect to sit quietly while a rival, a real one, moves in on it. Seen that way, the jealous shove isn't a separate, embarrassing quirk bolted onto an otherwise sweet relationship. It's the visible edge of the exact same bond that makes the quiet moments feel so good, the same wiring, just under a little pressure. So what do you actually do with this, practically, the next time it shows up in your house? Because understanding the mechanism is one thing. Living with a dog that's currently wedging itself between you and a new puppy is another. Here's how to translate the science into something useful, in the moment and over time. When your dog pushes between you and a new partner, a new baby, or another pet, the instinct is to scold it, no, stop, be nice. But remember what the studies actually showed. This isn't defiance, and it isn't your dog scheming against the newcomer. It's an old attachment alarm firing. Punishing the alarm doesn't turn it off. It usually just teaches your dog that the alarm itself is dangerous to express, which can make things tenser, not calmer. The better move is to gently guide your dog to a comfortable spot nearby, not banished, just repositioned so it can still see you and stay part of the moment. That answers the actual need underneath the behavior. Am I still included in this bond? Both studies point to the same lever. The behavior spikes when a bond feels suddenly, unpredictably redirected. You can take a lot of the edge off simply by front-loading attention before a known trigger. Greet your dog calmly for a minute before you pick up a new puppy. Sit with your resident dog before settling in with a partner on the couch. You're not rewarding jealousy. You're lowering how sharp the redirection feels in the first place, which is the actual mechanism at play. If you have more than one dog, or you're introducing a new pet, the Budapest study is your best guide. The sharpest reaction was specifically towards social rivals, not object. That means the fix isn't give every pet identical, simultaneous attention. That's often not realistic anyway. It's making sure every dog in the house still gets some protected one-on-one time where the bond isn't being split. A few minutes a day of undivided attention does more for a multi-dog household's peace than trying to referee every group interaction perfectly. It's also worth remembering that the dogs in that Budapest study weren't a random sample. The researchers specifically recruited dogs whose owners already described them as jealous types. That doesn't undo the finding, but it does mean the sharpest reaction to social rivals pattern was measured in dogs already primed to react. If your own dog is more laid back about other animals, don't assume something's wrong with it. Plenty of dogs simply score low on that same jealousy scale the researchers used to recruit their sample in the first place. And that's just normal variation, not a deficiency. One honest caveat, because this channel doesn't do feel good without the safety part. In the 2014 study, about a quarter of the dogs snapped at the stuffed toy. That's a real behavior, and it's worth taking seriously in your own home, especially around a new baby, a new pet, or a resource like food or a favorite spot. If your dog's response to a perceived threat to your bond includes stiffening, hard staring, growling, or snapping, that's no longer a cute, he's jealous moment, it's a safety moment. The fix isn't more affection in the heat of it. It's management, physical space, a trainer if it's frequent, and never leaving a dog alone with a baby or a new pet until you've seen calm, repeated, unsupervised worthy behavior. The same primordial wiring that makes a dog adorable when it leans into you can, in the wrong moment, express itself as real aggression. Respecting that is part of respecting the science, not a contradiction of it. Here's a small mental trick that comes straight from the study design. Next time your dog reacts to something, ask yourself the same question the researchers were asking. Is this reacting to anything new and interesting, or specifically to something that looks like it's competing for the relationship? A dog mildly curious about a delivery box on the porch is doing something different from a dog wedging itself between you and a new puppy. One is curiosity. The other is the bond alarm. Once you can tell them apart, your dog's behavior stops looking random and starts looking like exactly what the research says it is: legible, patterned, and rooted in something real. One more honest caveat before we close. Not every pushy, clingy, or attention-seeking moment is this bond alarm. Dogs recovering from an injury, in pain, or dealing with an underlying anxiety disorder can show similar-looking behavior, leaning hard into you, following you room to room, reacting badly when you interact with anyone or anything else without a rival ever being in the picture. If the jealous behavior shows up constantly, with or without a stuffed toy or a new pet anywhere nearby, and especially if it comes with new pacing, whining, appetite changes, or you can't identify anything that looks like a social rival triggering it, that's worth a conversation with your vet, not just a reframe. The studies we've covered tested a specific, identifiable trigger, a stuffed dog, a live rival, precisely so they could isolate the behavior. Real life is messier, and ruling out pain or general anxiety first is always step one. One overcorrection worth heading off. Some owners, once they learn a dog can react to a rival, decide the safe move is to dial back affection toward everyone and everything else. No more cuddling other dogs. No more holding a friend's baby around the house, just to avoid setting off the alarm. That's overkill, and it isn't what either study supports. Nothing here says your dog's bond is so fragile that it needs to be the exclusive center of your affection at all times. What the research actually shows is a specific, situational response to a specific kind of moment, not a diagnosis that your dog can't handle you loving other people or other animals. A securely attached dog, the same way a securely attached child does, can tolerate you having other relationships. The goal isn't to never trigger the alarm. It's to understand it when it goes off, respond calmly, and keep giving your dog the secure, reliable bond that makes the alarm go off less often and less intensely, over time. Here's what I want you to sit with. For a long time, the honest scientific answer to "is my dog jealous?" was basically, don't be silly, that requires a mind sophisticated enough to imagine mine. And in a narrow sense, that's still true. Your dog probably isn't running a mental movie about betrayal, comparing itself to a rival, worrying about what you secretly think. It isn't rehearsing a grudge or building a case against the new puppy. But two independent research teams, on 2 continents, 4 years apart, found something real underneath that question anyway. Something that looks less like adult jealousy and more like the oldest, simplest form of it. An infant's protest when a bond it depends on suddenly points somewhere else. That's not a lesser emotion. It might be the root the whole tree grew from. So the next time your dog shoulders its way between you and a phone, a new partner, a stuffed toy, or a new puppy, you don't have to call it silly. And you don't have to call it just like a person. You can call it exactly what 2 labs measured it to be, a primordial signal running on some of the oldest social wiring your dog has, doing the one job it was built to do, telling you this bond still matters. It's not proof your dog thinks like you do. It's proof your dog is not indifferent to you, which, if you've ever doubted where you stand with an animal that can't say it in words, might be the more reassuring finding of the two. If this changed how you'll read that shove next time, do me a favor. Tell me in the comments, does your dog do this? And with what, exactly? A toy? Another pet? I read every one. If you want more of the real psychology behind what looks like just cute dog behavior, the kind backed by actual published research, not guesswork, subscribe. Because that's the whole reason Pet Mind Labs exists. To turn peer-reviewed science into something you can actually watch happening on your living room floor. Next time, we're going even deeper into your dog's emotional world. I'm glad you're here. This is Pet Mind Labs. Stop guessing. Start seeing.